Hello and welcome to Developmental Psychology. Today we're going to be talking about what is development. Human development or lifespan development. What exactly is it we're going to be studying in this class? I love this word. A couple of years ago, I came across it. You know how it is with learning. I had to just keep repeating it over and over and over in my head until I remembered it. But ontogenesis, what a great word to introduce a class. This is the development of an individual organism or anatomical or behavioral feature from the earliest stage to maturity. Again, you'll always have these long definitions. But again, when I think of ontogenesis, I think about the development of a person across the lifespan. And that's what we're going to be studying in this class. Since we're in psychology, of course, we're always focused more on the individual rather than the group development. But again, we can't have one without the other because it requires the group for us to develop. So in this class, we'll always take a nice biopsychosocial approach that's going to be looking at the body and the physical structure of the mind, then the psychological factors like cognition, motivation, emotion, things along those lines, and then the social context, how our variables in the social context associated with our development. Your book defines developmental science as changes in stability across multiple domains of psychology and social functioning. Again, it's this whole interrelated process. You'll often hear the idea of nature versus nurture, heredity versus the social context, which one plays out the most. And there's no exact statistic, but for example, you could argue, and research does argue, that your personality, for example, is half genetics and half observation, cognition, psychological factors, and then the other part, molding of the social context. Okay, so of course, our biology and our heredity has a lot to do with our development, but so does our personal factors, like the way we think and our approach to life and our philosophy. And then also the social factors, like what kind of family were you raised in? What's your culture like? What's your community like? What country do you live in? Okay. Because again, just basic things like language structure our brain. The type of language that you speak structures the neural pathways in your brain. And that might sound a little bit odd, but if you take someone from Germany and someone from China and you ask them to do 2 plus 2, their actual neural pathways look a little bit different because the way they think is a little bit different because of the social context that they were raised in and the fact that they speak a different language create a different brain structure. However, if you take two people from Germany and superimpose their brains while doing 1 plus 1, the neural pathways seem to look the same. Okay. So again, hopefully you'll realize this is an insanely complex class because in order to understand developmental psychology, we have to understand everything about the body, hormones, and how all this stuff functions, and cells and nerves, and the structure of the brain, and how all of these things are motivating us to behave in a certain way. And really, when you're thinking, which is, the psychology of cognition, is really just neurons releasing neurotransmitters, and somehow that's the way everything works. And so, again, it's all so complicated, but this is just more of an introduction to developmental psychology. So you don't have to be an expert in all of these things and know everything about the body and the brain and the social context to be great at this class. But hopefully that's the fun in this class, is that there's so much that we can talk about because we're looking at human development across the lifespan, which is insanely broad. That means we have to understand all things human, how we started, how we are ended up where we are, and everything in between. So it's just very, 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 very complex, which is awesome. So again, I'm always very excited to teach this class. But from a main psychological focus, we're going to be looking at physical and neurophysiological processes. Again, cognition, language, emotion, personality, morality, psychosocial development, meaning the psychology of the brain and the brain evolution, and then how that's influenced by the social context, including our relationships with others. Because again, so much of who you are is based upon the people that you were surrounded by and how much they've invested in you. That's pretty complex. So, again, in order to know something about someone, do we need to know about every other person they've ever talked to, every stimuli they've ever received, every movie they've ever seen, to understand a person? And probably it's that complicated, okay? So, developmental psychology over time, again, psychology as a science is relatively new. Maybe the 1880s is a pretty good origin. We're thinking about psychology. So, we're only 150 years in. But when the psychology of developmental psychology, or the study of developmental psychology started, we first started looking at infants and children. Then we, of course, moved on to adolescence because that's the next stage, right? Then we started looking at aging and created fields like gerontology. Now we're looking at things across the entire lifespan, ontogenesis, looking at something, the development across the lifespan. And back in the day, we used to think once you hit 25 and your prefrontal cortex was fully developed, you were done. We found out that's not the case. Neurons keep growing. The brain has this thing called plasticity, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Back in the day, you also had all these theories like so much of your childhood influences who you are in the future. And, the Freudian, your childhood experiences then, create these unconscious processes that are all trying to get out. And yeah, that's probably like something that's interesting that we could talk about and that will come up in this class. But again, how much of you is associated with your childhood and how much of you is associated with who you are now as a person and the way you think now? Even if you had a tough childhood, were you able to be resilient, overcome that? Or is that childhood still affecting you? Are you still experiencing trauma, for example? And so again, it's very, very complex. And so just to assume that, the way we were raised or whatever accounts for how we are now is a bit of a misnomer. But again, all these things are interrelated. Of course, the way we grew up and how we were treated as kids and what kind of environment we lived in and what kind of exposure and did we have love and hugs and comfort, and then what kind of society were we raised in? Were we raised in a harsh society where people were supposed to be tough and we were all Vikings and we're teaching our kids to be violent and then go over to England and conquer? Or is we sweet? Back in the day, we didn't even have this concept of childhood, but now in modern times, we've extended childhood almost to 25 years old. And so, again, the idea of childhood itself has changed over time. When I'm teaching marriage and family, that's often a popular conversation because, again, back in the day, we used to look at children more as economic factors. And to us in modern times, to think about children economically, like what utility do they serve, is a bit odd. But back in the day, that would have been a common way of thinking about children. And so, again, history, society, our general cultural attitudes all play a role in our development and the way we think, the way we feel, the way we behave, what we find acceptable, what's morally acceptable. Okay. We're also looking at some ideas of how growth and change occurs throughout the lifespan, the evolution of the self. To assume that, by the time you're 5, you have yourself firmly established would also be a misnomer. Yes, so much of you is established by the time you were 5. However, are you constantly evolving throughout the lifespan? And it's an awesome question that we will be discussing. Just think about all the new experiences you might have, or maybe you just don't feel the way you used to. Maybe you're into new stuff. Maybe the same old doesn't do it for you anymore. You're ready for a change. And then this new idea of adulthood as being a dynamic and cognitive, social, and psychological development that, is continuing across the lifespan is new. The idea that we can still be 90, 92 and out rock climbing and trying new things is pretty incredible. I just watched a great documentary the other day about Fred Becky, who was in his 90s still out trying to rock climb and trying to do first and cents. And it's just completely incredible that we can still do that. So again, are we constantly growing? Do we reach a point in our lives where we're like, that's it, I'm done growing and I'll never be any better than I am now? Again, good debates to have in this class, some fun discussions. In this class, we're going to take this biopsychosocial approach. Okay. And again, when we're talking about the biological approach, the book breaks it down as the physical domain, including changes in height and weight, sensory capabilities, the nervous system, propensity for death and illness. How do all these factors affect us across the lifespan? And so when you get into childhood development, so much of it's the body changes, especially going into adolescence. Then you get into these sexual developments and hormonal changes. And then your brain is still evolving even into adulthood. And again, if your brain is still evolving a lot, like not just like some plasticity, like where you're learning over time and you're learning some new crystallized knowledge, but like actual huge physical development is still going on until you're 25. How well along really are we at 25? I always like to ask the question, should we wait till we're 25? Should we get married? Because our brain really hasn't formulated this ability to be logical completely as much as we could, at least potentially, until we're about 25. So it's just a big joke. Not to say that anyone needs to get married, but maybe before we make these life decisions, we should wait till we're 25. Just a fun question. We're talking about psychological factors. Again, we're looking at intelligence, wisdom, perception, problem solving, memory, language, emotions, cognition, just all of that area. But we're also talking about the structure of the brain itself. And so when you learn an introduction to psychology, for example, of that, brain and body, nervous system and peripheral nervous system and sensory nervous system, and how they're all working together. And it's how your body communicates with your brain and your brain communicates with your body. Your body releases hormones into your bloodstream to tell your brain you're hungry. And then your brain is like, I'm hungry. And then it tells your body to move its legs so you can go out and find some food. When you're looking at development and our behavior, you have to look at the fact that our body is actually driving us. And so is our unconscious mind, along with our conscious mind, along with those cultural influences that are structuring our behavior. Okay. And so the psychosocial is that blend, right? Of you have the way you think is influenced by the society, the way you behave is structured by social control norms, and police and things along those lines that structure our behavior, that limit what we're allowed to do within those social rules. And we adapt or adopt those social rules into our own personal ideology of how we should think and how we should behave, which then affects our overall behavior. But again, as we develop our ideologies, it begins when we're young and we're children, through the stimulus response learning and operant conditioning and observational learning and social learning and just general cognitions and thinking for yourself. It is such an amazing process. And then the sociology of it all is looking at things like socioeconomic status, because whether or not you want to admit it, your parents' socioeconomic status, the type of school you go to, is associated with how well you do on things like IQ tests. And you don't want to admit the harsh realities that some people are invested in more in society, and that we develop children of more affluence more than we do children in poverty. But again, that's the inequality of it all. That's the prejudice and the discrimination and the lack of access that occurs. So are things like race and your parents' socioeconomic status associated with your overall educational attainment, which is then associated with your overall development? Yes, not because of your race, but because of your race. And that sounds kind of strange. Your intelligence is not associated with your race, but your socioeconomic status is. And poverty is associated with intelligence. Therefore, those in poverty are less likely to have that social investment, to the good education, to get the skills, to be able to get through college, to get the educational attainment. And again, it's that back and forth of how is the society you grow up in associated with your overall development. And again, it's very, very complex. I'm just throwing out a bunch of ideas just to get you thinking about some of this stuff early on. But later on in this class, we're going to delve into this much more thoroughly. Okay. Your book talks about reflexivity. So I introduced it, the definition and epistemology, and more specifically, the sociology of knowledge. Reflexivity refers to circular relationships between cause and effect. That's what I'm talking about. The circular relationship between the biological factors, your body motivating and driving you, your psychological factors, unconscious and conscious processes, and then the social factors, which then structure your overall development and your behavior in the end. Okay. So again, it's very complex, this class, but I hope you guys like the biopsychosocial approach that we do take to it, because it does give you a nice, rich approach to how people development across the lifespan. So just some key points about lifespan development. Again, our new understanding as time goes on, and again, our knowledge is always being constantly updated, but development is lifelong. So again, we're going to take that ontogenesis approach of studying people not just in their childhood or adolescence or early adulthood, but across the entire lifespan. Development is multi-directional and multi-dimensional. Again, it's not just necessarily this linear relationship where we all just go from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to stage death. Okay, it goes in all kinds of directions, and for everybody it's a little bit different, and things are unique, and not everybody follows the same lifespan path, and there's a lot of different variables in the social context and individually that account for similar and differential development. Okay. We're going to look at development, including both gains and losses. Again, what happens when we get old? I have to admit it. My age is catching up with me. I can't run as well as I used to. My 16-year-old child can just, if I try to race him, 2 seconds later, he's down the street and that's it. I just have to acknowledge it. However, I have more crystallized knowledge than my son does because of age. So I've got some gains. Whatever. Development is characterized by plasticity. Again, plasticity, this idea that we can change, we can develop, we can evolve, we can have new experiences, we can create new neurons, we can make our neural pathways more efficient, we can create new neural pathways for new ways of thinking. Again, if you've never played the violin before and at 50, all of a sudden you start playing violin, that's going to change your brain. Plasticity. You can always teach an old person new tricks. I'm still learning new things despite my age. Development is embedded in historical and social context. Again, we have to consider, how do we get here? And we could definitely open up Pandora's box when we look at things like gender roles and gender development and how culture and history is associated with gender development and differences between people. We will open up that Pandora's box when we get there, but I don't want to spend all day on this first lecture going off on that. But things we're going to talk about, okay? But again, we have to understand, how do we get here and how does the social context structure us, structure our development? It's very important. So again, I teach both psychology and sociology. So it gives me that individual to the group and then the group to the individual. And then the biology is mixed in with all of that chaos. But it really helps, that circular knowledge from how am I developing and then how are people out here shaping me? Okay, that's very interesting. We look at that as like agents of socialization. As you interact in the social context, agents of socialization socialize you, influence the way you think, etc. Okay. Development is multiply determined. Lifespan theorists argue that development is caused by multiple factors. Again, both biological, physical, and environmental factors. Biopsychosocial. Again, we need history, we need biology, psychology, sociology, physics, chemistry to understand how all of our body works and how our mind works and how the society works, to understand people and how we develop. Okay. And again, development is multidisciplinary. We're going to look at many academic fields. Again, history, biology, psychology, sociology. And that's why it's such a fun class to teach and learn about, because we can bounce all over the place as we examine development across the lifespan. So lifespan perspective, contextualism versus paradigm. Baltz identified 3 specific developmental systems of influence, all of which include biological and environmental forces. Okay, so we can look at this from an age-specific approach. So if we're going to be looking at lifespan development, we can look at it in the stages of babies and toddlers, and then adolescents, into teenagers, into young adults, into middle-aged adults, into seniors. And we can break these out into any arbitrary category and then attach age ranges to these categories and call it what we want. We can also look at it as cohorts, group of people who were born in the same time frame. And again, I don't like to think about the fact that, maybe the whole Gen Z, baby boomers, that influences us, like the time frame where you grew up. But you know what? It does, because the culture you grew up in is associated with how you develop over time. And then we're going to look at non-normative influences also. People's development is shaped by specific influences that are not organized by age or time, such as immigrating or having an accident or a death of a parent. Okay, these can just be circumstantial things that can happen. But again, I put this up because I'm always arguing with my sister-in-law about this, because she's always trying to categorize me, and I'm always like, don't categorize me. What are you trying to say? Don't assume that I'm just like every other person that was born in the same cohort as I am. But I have to admit that the culture you were raised in does influence the way you think. So again, which generation are you? This is from your book, so of course I had to put it in here. And I fall into the millennials, born in 82, Is that associated with the way I think? it's like the Enneagram or any of those personality tests. Do we fall into these things? Does that stuff actually hold up? Are they valid and reliable? It's a good question. But again, culture and the age time you grew up is associated with some factors. So lifespan versus life expectancy. Lifespan refers to the maximum age any member of a species can reach under optimal conditions. And again, when it comes to humans, a little bit over 100, a little into the hundreds and tens is pretty much record breaking. And then life expectancy is the average numbers of years a person born in a particular time can typically expect to live. I feel like it's around 77 for males right now and 81 for females. I'd have to look. More specifically, we'll pull out the statistics when we get to that. And then you have to look at it by country, like US versus Europe. People in the US die earlier than people in Europe. Why? There's some theoretical conceptions of age, like how old are you? There's chronological age, like the number of years. Your biological age, like looking at the shape of your body. Your psychological age, how old do you think you are? And then our social age, how do we group people according to these arbitrary categories? Um, Age periods of development. I'm going to be a little bit critical when it comes to stage theories in this class, but you could apply the stage theories and say that there are these common experiences, these common stages that human beings tend to go through as we develop. And so your book breaks it out as the prenatal stage, conception, and then ends at birth, infancy and toddlerhood, birth to 2, early childhood 2 to 6, middle and late childhood 6 to about 11 or 12 at puberty, adolescence, puberty to about 18. I might argue 21, maybe 25 these days. Emerging adulthood 18 to 25, early adulthood 25 to 40 to 45, so says the book, and then late adulthood 65 and onward. And again, these are just arbitrary categories. These are human constructions. We're the ones who come up with these categories. They don't necessarily exist in nature. It's just our method of grouping things according to commonalities and things that we see. Because again, when a child is born, are there not just some pretty, some milestones in there? When a female is pregnant, are there not some milestones of development? When a kid turns like 6 and 7 and all of a sudden they're using all these abstract terminologies and they can start to think in abstract ways, is that another milestone? And so there are some of these shared experiences that we can't argue. In puberty, our bodies start going through certain things. In menopause, our bodies start going through certain things. Across the lifespan, at different times, our bodies go through different things. So again, there are milestones that we can categorize. But again, they're arbitrary and they're not singular, and not everyone fits into every category at the same exact time. Your book gets into some of the theories of development, which we're going to go into deeper in this class. But just to give you a quick introduction of some of the grand paradigms, some of the grand theories, some of our ways of approaching developmental psychology, our sets of assumptions about the nature of humans and their development. So in this book, your book breaks it down into 6 key assumptions, okay? So we have assumptions about human nature. Again, I like to think about it is, does our brain, is it a blank slate, or is there predetermined behaviors that we are going to engage in? Then you have your causes of development, looking at nature versus nurture, the biology and the structure of the brain versus your personal cognition and the social context. Again, the role of the individual, are we passive, are we active learners? Our temperaments, our personality factors, our individual genetics will all play a role there. Stability versus change. Look at us across the lifespan. How is your personality? Has it fluctuated over time? Has your emotional states and your temperament fluctuated over time? Or are you rather stable over across the lifespan? Continuity versus discontinuity, whether development involves quantitative incremental changes or big qualitative shifts. And then assumptions about universality versus context specificity. Specificity. Try saying it 3 times as fast. Whether development follows a universal pathway or depends more on specific life in an environmental context. Again, that argument of, is it a linear process? Does it kind of bounce all over? Does every individual follow the same course of development, for example? These are some really cool questions to ask. So again, assumptions about human development, human nature, nature versus nurture, active versus passive learning. Are we as a person stable, or are we changing over time? Is our development continuous and linear, or is it just like all of a sudden something happens and it changes us? We'll look at stage theories of development in this class, continuous theories of development, again, those ontogenesis processes, then universal versus context specific. Your 5 major meta theories, which are your grand theories, and then you can kind of put everything in these. Your book breaks it down into maturational meta theory. We are seeds that grow into plants, and then we are influenced by our bodies, okay, that then drive us and motivate us, a lot of that predetermined behavior. Mechanistic meta theory, kind of applying our bodies or our brains like computers, right? We take in information, we learn, and then we spit it back out. Organismic meta theory, are we butterflies that are curious and observing and interested in trying to find our way and get into stuff? Contextual meta theory, looking at that nature-nurture interaction between the individual and the social context. And then cognitivism, again, the cognitions in our brain, the way we think, the way our mind works, our self-esteem, or how we feel about ourselves, all will play a role into this. Who we model, who do we identify with? All these little things will play into that. We'll go deeper into that when we delve into cognitive psychology, or like a cognitive approach to developmental psychology. So you have your historical theories of development, your pre-formationists. Again, is our brain fully formed and our personality fully formed when we were born? Or is it more like tabula rasa, our brain is like a blank slate? And again, I like to think about it as a mix, because your genetics totally play a role in your personality. Whether or not it's 50-50 genetics versus, the rest of it, cognition and social context, is a big debate, but your genes are going to play a huge role. Just look at people in your family. Do you kind of act like them? Do you have similar mannerisms? Do the way you talk, is it similar? And so there are some of these predetermined factors that are at play. But again, we can deviate from our genetics by being like, no, I don't want to be that way, even though my genes want me to be that way. And plus, you learn things and you have all these diverse experiences. And then those diverse experiences in the environment are then associated with gene activation. And that's epigenetics. Like, the environment can actually influence your gene activation. It's so complex, which we'll get to in this class, biopsychosocial. Rousseau, the French revolutionist, talked about the natural plan unfolding in stages, one of the first stage theorists. Cassell looked at neuromotor development, again, our brains and our neural pathways growing over time, and then they're influenced by our genetics. And then Freud, again, looking at the unconscious processes, childhood processes, how all of this influences over time, looking at the social psychology of the id, ego, and superego. You have your inner self, your id, then you have your social self, the superego, which knows the rules of the land. And then your ego is like that voice in your head that's being like, look, dude, you can't just act the way you want to because society says you got to be cool and you can't be all like wild and stuff. That's kind of your ego, that voice in your head. So again, we'll get so much deeper into all of these theories. I'm just trying to introduce you to a lot of them just to get you, walking through some of the cool ideas about what we're going to study in this class. Contemporary theories of development, we're going to look at Erikson's psychosocial theory in 8 stages. I have a slide coming up, looking at each period of life having a unique challenge or crisis that the person must then overcome to then go to the next stage. And again, successful development involves dealing with these goals. Like, my daughter is 6, and so to me, her riding a bike and learning how to read were very important for that next stage of development. So of course I was all like, you have to read. And I was all like, you are going to learn to ride this bike without training wheels, But that's probably not in a book anywhere. But like, as a parent, I was like, those are big milestones for me. Yeah, talking was a big one. Walking was a big one, I guess. But riding that bike, that was the one that really mattered to me. So your book breaks out Erikson's psychosocial stages, which we'll go in deeper later on. But again, they kind of look at it as birth to 12 to around 18 months. This is when you interact with your parents. You learn that social interaction. You start to use words and things along those lines. 18 to 3 years, the child learns that they cannot be controlled and develops their own personality. It just goes loose. 3 to 6 years, they become independent, exploring, manipulative, and taking action. And then 6 to 12, they become perfect little children as they internalize the rules of society, and then they follow all the rules. And then all of a sudden puberty kicks in and they're all hoodlums running around with their friends going wild. And then they're out of high school and they're on their own. And then they deal with the stress of life and they're all like, I gotta get married and fall in love and all this stuff you're told you're supposed to do in your life, which who knows if that's actually the meaning of life in the first place? I don't know. And then you're like, oh crap, I'm 40. I'm old now. I wish I was still back in high school. And then you hit 65 and you're like, I'm 65. What's going to happen now? Am I looking toward the next generation and raising them? Because that's what it says right here. We develop an interest in guiding the next generation. Am I going to feel that way when I'm 65? Like, I'm going to be like selfish instead. Like, the heck with that. I'm going skiing. My grandkids can figure it out. I don't know, but that's what the book says, right? That's why I like to critique the stages because these are cool. Yes, at some point, right? You become grandparents, and all of a sudden, you're all like, I care about the next generation. All of a sudden, is that really the way it always plays out for everyone? Does everyone even have kids? Does everyone even become a grandparent? Does everyone at 65 even get exposed to kids to care about the next generation in the first place? Things are a little bit different than when Erickson wrote this. Okay, Erickson wrote this back, well, like the 50s or something like that. Things have changed since these stages were broken out. But it's good to introduce you so you can kind of see the evolution of the way we think about development. And then all of a sudden, 65 to death, the person accepts how I have lived. So here I am on my deathbed reflecting back, like, did I enjoy my life? And did I do everything I thought I was going to do? Is that really what I'm going to be doing on my deathbed instead of like freaking out, like, I don't want to die. I want to go have more fun. So again, I like the stages. It's a good approach to kind of getting like a basic understanding about how humans develop across the lifespan. But to assume these are universally applied to every culture and every country and every individual on the planet would again be a complete misnomer. But it's a good guide. So when we talk about the stages in this class, it's a nice guide. That's how I like to think about it. Behaviorism, you'll get a lot of this in intro to psychology and then learning theories and beyond. But we're looking at behaviorism. We're looking at the classical conditioning, learning through stimulus and response, Pavlov dog, operant conditioning, learning through rewards and punishments, and then observational learning, again, being able to go out in the world and explore stuff, which is social learning theory. Social learning theory says that, we are curious people, that we are little sponges, right? Our brain is, we're being socialized by others. We're going out, we're trying to figure out the world. We're observing, we're thinking about it, we're internalizing it, we're reflecting it, then we're making decisions, then we're going out and doing stuff, okay? And so again, Bandura highly emphasized observation and imitating others. Think about when you're a teenager, you like think someone's cool and you start dressing that way, right? Let's try that on for size and see if that's who we are until we decide who we are, kind of stuff, okay? But again, we also influence our surroundings. So it's a reciprocal relationship between society influencing us and us being members of society and influencing society itself. You could call that the social construction of reality, whereas social actors work together to build society, to build culture, to build this, the social world that we live in. Okay. Cognitive theories. We're going to be looking at things like Piaget and Vygotsky. When I was talking about intelligence and I was talking about things like poverty, that's from Vygotsky. Vygotsky says that children don't become rocket scientists in the wild. Children become rocket scientists when we as a society invest in these kids and we force them and we challenge their brains and we make them work really, really hard. But not every kid has as much opportunity as everybody else. And not every kid wants to sit down and study for 20 years to become a rocket scientist. And so again, there's going to be all kinds of things we'll talk about. But cognitive theories, I like to think about it as like the science of thinking, okay? And it's often referred to like as a computer information processing, but it's far more than that because your brain is taking signals from your body and from the social context and putting all of that together. And then it has its own neurons just for thinking about stuff in the brain. And so it's a very complicated process, cognitive psychology in itself, because the psychology of thinking requires delving into all these fields to see what influences how we think. But again, things like reasoning, our heuristics, our methods for problem solving, again, how we approach a math problem was taught by others. You don't necessarily go out and just figure out how to do complex calculus. You might be doing a first ascent at some calculus problem, But again, we're constantly building off of the work of others. And then we have to learn the work of others to then build on that, for example. Okay. And then uh Piaget's stages are a little more simple than Erickson's. He has the sensory motor for 2 years where we're, again, trying to figure out the world a little bit, use our language. 2 to 7 will become perfect kids. 7 to 11, we're out trying to figure out school and abstract thinking. 11 to adulthood, that's when we can finally think. All right. So Piaget is a little bit different because it's not really lifespan stages. It's more about almost brain development stages. Because think about when you're birth to two, what can you actually do? It's called the sensory motor stage because your brain doesn't have the ability for complex language yet. You can't reason out problems. You don't understand reality yet. You have to learn when you hear that sound that it's a train or it's a car or it's a cat. And you have to learn the word for the sound and for the object itself. And then 2 to 7, the kids are like little sponges. They start to be able to use language and be able to interpret the world, but they don't fully understand it. Plus, they can't think outside of their own heads. They don't have that theory of mind yet where they can get out of their heads and put themselves into someone else's head and try to figure out what they're thinking. That again comes with time. It's not really until kids are past 11 that they can really do that. About 7, they start to learn how to do abstract thinking. But the idea of being able to put yourself in somebody else's head, that comes a little bit later. Okay. And then that grows over time as our emotional intelligence and our, tends to grow over time with it. And then just to wrap this up, our ecological systems theory is, again, just a really good approach to this biopsychosocial thing. You have the individual in the center here, right? And with this is all of our biological factors, our age, our sex, all these things, our cognitions. And then you have this microsystem, which is like your primary agents of socialization, like those closest to you. And then you have your mesosystem, which is, they don't even have it labeled in here. But again, it's like your secondary socialization. Like like your acquaintances or the people in your city, things along those lines. Then you have your exosystem, which is like your big social institutions like media, education system, the legal system, government, things along those lines. Then it has it broke out to the macro system, which is your overall attitudes, ideologies of our larger culture, which could be multiple countries, multiple regions, all mixed into one. Okay. So again, this lecture was just a really quick introduction to what we're going to be looking at in this class. Again, that biopsychosocial approach to reality, biopsychosocial approach to development across the lifespan. We need to be thinking about all the things going on in our body, all the things going on in our brain, and all the things going on in the social context, plus the history of how we got here to be able to understand how people develop across the lifespan. So thank you so much and have a great day.